Well, as we come into the fall, there are at least two major sporting associations that are vying for your time and interest. The NFL starts next Sunday. Maybe nobody knew that. No. Well, the NFL starts next Sunday, and it's vying for your time. And as they prepare for the season, every player and coach and CEO and franchise has one thing on their mind: to win. To go to the big game, the Super Bowl. That is the only thing that anybody ever talks about in an interview, is winning. And you'll also notice that as the leaves change, Major League Baseball begins to wind up its season. Some teams already knowing that they didn't win enough, and they're getting rid of players and they're moving on to next year. Others are still hoping to win enough to get into the postseason. Blue Jays are in that situation, right, Lonnie? And they're hoping that they can win enough games in the next few weeks to make it to the postseason. And not just the postseason, but the pennant, right? To win the big series, the World Series. And we could probably talk about the CFL. There are some teams that are doing quite well, some that are not doing as well. But every team, including the CFL, including the Edmonton Elks, who thought they would do much better this season than that they actually have, only have one thing on their mind: winning. The goal of every major sports franchise player, from IndyCar racing to football to soccer, is all focused on one thing: winning. Winning builds brands, and winning gets fame and fortune and prestige. This is not just the case for sports, but it's for about every place in our world. Win. I don't know if you have watched the HBO show Succession. I have not watched it, but I've seen it advertised. And it's just wrapped up its fourth season this spring. And it chronicles the media enterprise mogul Logan Roy and his adult children, sons Kendall and Roman and daughter Shiv. And the whole show is about who will succeed Logan, the father. Who will run the business after he's gone? And it's a painful spectacle of excess of wealth, power, vindication, childhood wounds, meanness, and power. And the list goes on. Each character accepts such patterns as this is the way to gain the world, to win. Though there are some moments of hesitation, none of them are able to break the cycle. The show does not shy away from showing mostly private moments of misery as each sibling endures before they decide what's the next backstabbing, swindling, duplicitous move that they have to make in order to go down this path of winning. Even in the final scene of the series, as the board meets to decide who will take over the company, and it feels a bit like a judgment scene, and each board member casts a vote for or against son Kendall Roy. It leaves doubt in the viewer's mind about Shiv Roy, the daughter, about who she will vote for or against. Does she vote for her brother, knowing that, much like her father, it will destroy him? Does she vote against her brother, knowing that her estranged husband will become CEO, and it will be the closest thing that she will ever get to running the business? The Roy family is one who has gained the whole world, but lost their life in the process. If they had not been disciples of the family pattern and family way of doing business, what kind of life might they have found otherwise? We come to our passage this morning in Matthew 16, which makes us wrestle with this idea. this need to win, to succeed, to need power and influence as the only way to get ahead in life. Now, since the time of Constantine, when Christianity found its way into power and politics and influence, thanks to his conversion and demand that everyone become a Christian and have a power and have the position of privilege and equality with all other religions. That has been the major way of thinking for the past 1,500 years for Christians. At least in our part of the world, in the Western part of the world, it has been a major way of thinking. And many of us have grown up with this idea and belief that if we just had the right Christian politician in power, or if the church just had the right influence in culture, school, business, then we would be able to set the world right again. It's been the major way of thinking for 1,500 years. But for the first 300 years after Jesus' resurrection, Christians did not have such privilege. We read in the pages of Scripture and we know that Christians were treated horribly. They were persecuted and killed for their faith, scattered across the known world. So how do we deal with these two realities? On one hand, we all want to win. We want Christians to have power and influence for good. And on the other hand, as we'll see today, Jesus calls us to something very different. A culture that is much different than winning. It really looks like losing. So let's read Matthew 16:21 and on. From that time, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, that he must be killed on the third day and be raised again to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. Truly, I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Just verses before this, Peter proclaims Jesus as the King, the Messiah, which we talked a little bit about last week. He and the rest of the disciples are ready to follow Jesus as he makes his way to Jerusalem. The main thinking in Jesus' day was that when the Messiah does come, he will fix all that's wrong in the world. He will be king, overthrowing the powers that be, rid the unjust religious leaders, and set things right politically and socially. In other words, Jesus will win. And through Jesus, the nation of Israel will once again be established in its rightful place as God's people. This is partly what must have been going on in the disciples' minds as they proclaimed Jesus as the Messiah. Peter was ready and he was convinced. He'd been called out by God to be the rock upon which God will build his church. He was given a specific name and keys to the kingdom, which all sounds well and good and promising for Peter, doesn't it? It sounds like a win. It sounds like all the way forward for Peter is privilege and success and winning, riding on the tailcoats of Jesus, the Messiah. And Peter says, never, 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 Jesus, will this happen to you. Never say never, right? Isn't that the saying? Because we don't really know how to grasp what God is doing in our lives. Though Jesus has given hints all the way along through the book of Matthew of what the Messiah was going to be like, how the Messiah was going to bring about his kingdom. He was not going to win in the eyes of the world. He had hinted all along, even from chapter 5, blessed are the poor in spirit, the meek, the peacemakers, those that are persecuted. Here Jesus calls his followers to lose their very lives, to take up the cross and follow him. In our day and age, some would say that only applies to certain people. Those that are in ministry, those that are missionaries, those that are full-time clergy. But Jesus doesn't offer that category for us. He calls all of us to take up our cross, to put our faith in him, to live in some kind of upside-down, backward life that looks like losing to the world around us, doesn't it? But we have grown so accustomed to winning. We want to win. We want our sports teams to win. We want our kids to win. We want to win in our careers. We want to win in life. I don't like losing. Do you? No. Peter struggles with this, and we struggle with it as well. We struggle with giving up things that we like, our place of comfort, the things that we enjoy, the surroundings that we have grown accustomed to. And we utter these words, at least I have, never. Never, I will never. Ever uttered those words? God, I will never move to Manitoba. Or God, I will never stand on a stage and preach on a Sunday morning. Never will I teach Sunday school or hang out with teenagers on a Friday night. I will never utter those words. I've uttered those words too many times, and here we are. I will never move to Canada. I will never move somewhere else. Peter says these words, never, Lord. Never on my watch will this happen to you. And Peter is rebuked by Jesus in those moments, call them Satan. We want to follow Jesus, don't we? But we also want to win. We want to win with our families and our careers and our marriage, and we want to win at church. We want to only ever have success in all areas of our life. We want more people, not less. We want to have great worship and preaching and really good coffee all the time. I don't know if you noticed, but some of our lights aren't working this morning. Sometimes things just don't work out, right? And we've grown accustomed in the Western world to winning and saying never and getting away with it. But does it fit with what Jesus is telling us and what Jesus is telling Peter today? What he's telling us when we say, yes, Lord, I'll follow you, but. Chelsea Hammond, an author, writes this: when Jesus describes those who choose to take up this task, taking up your cross, using the present tense to follow, he's inviting Peter and anyone else who wants to discover the true meaning of life to continuously follow him. It is in the pattern of Jesus that we discover that path of true life. This will mean sacrifice and learning new models for what really matters. It will mean changing our views, our lifestyles, our interactions, so that we don't run away from what is hard and uncomfortable or challenging and provokes our fears. It will mean being honest with our experiences, so that we can discern whether what we are enduring is the will of God or something else. Whether we are losing something for the sake of Christ or acting selfishly for ourselves in some other way. So where do we go from here? 3 things this morning that I think we can get out of this passage this morning. 1, and we know this, never say never. Never say never. I don't think the Trinity is sitting up there thinking, well, yep, he said never, so let's send him to Manitoba. Oh, she said never, so let's get her up on stage. God doesn't work that way, but God does work upside down and sometimes backwards. He calls us to hard tasks that we are uncomfortable with. He calls us to new things that we would rather not do. Second, we can't fully grasp God's plan for us, can we? Or for his world. In many ways, it feels like Christianity is losing a stronghold in our world. And I guess we probably are in some ways. But in other ways, God is moving in miraculous ways. Not in power or influence or in politics, but in small, somewhat insignificant ways in the eyes of the world, but powerful ways. Just as he did with his disciples, 11 men sent out to proclaim Jesus transformed the world. God can use us in his upside-down, backwards economy to bring about peace and shalom to the world, to bring about love and forgiveness to those that need it. And sometimes that looks rather foolish to the world around us. Third, Jesus is asking us, and he's asking his disciples to continually work in changing their lives. To follow Jesus means to continually to follow Jesus. It's not a prayer at one point in your life, knowing that once you prayed that prayer, you get to go to heaven. It's a continual life-changing decision. And every day we get to rise and choose to win in the eyes of the world or to win in the eyes of Jesus, which requires us to pick up our cross and follow him. How will you follow Jesus today? Will it look a little upside down and backwards? Will it look like winning to the rest of the world? Is it all about numbers and power and money and politics? Because if it is, Jesus never worked that way. He worked in small groups of people. He worked with the outcasts and the sinners. Those 12 disciples were reject disciples. They were fishermen. They were not studious enough to make it into the schools of those days. They were fishermen, tax collectors. And they became Jesus' followers. And they took that and they went and they shared the good news of Jesus to everybody everybody that wanted to hear. Yes, some of them lost their lives, persecuted for their faith. Some of us will be persecuted for our faith, depending on where we work and what we do. And Jesus calls us to faithfully follow him as we do so. It will look upside down and backwards. to the world around us. It will look like losing. And are we okay with that? Are we okay to invest into a franchise of losers? That is the question. That's the question Jesus brings to his disciples and to us. Are we ready to invest in the people that we know, that want to follow Jesus, that want to invest in knowing Jesus as the Messiah? It's not always going to be great and wonderful. It's not always going to look like winning. Sometimes it will be hard and difficult. Sometimes it will be challenging. And sometimes it will be amazing. Sometimes we'll get worship right. Sometimes I'll get preaching right. And we'll feel good on a Sunday morning. But we still need to make that decision as we leave the doors of the church. Who will we follow? Who will we follow as we go about the rest of our week? Who will we follow when financially it gets a little bit tighter and a little bit tighter? Who will we follow when it's not the popular thing to do on a Sunday morning? Who will we follow when we ask, will you commit a little bit more time and energy in some way? That's when the rubber meets the road. And Jesus invites us in to follow him and to take up our cross.